Anyways, the point is not so much to necessarily have perfect balance, but instead to change the game to become more dynamic. I know, let me be specific about what I mean, because you can just say that. The idea is a lot of games will end up getting to a point where it feels like you're on a timer. Whether it's essentially late game Terran versus Zerg against Ghosts, or with Protoss against Zerg on the ground, kind of forcing them into carriers, stuff like that. A lot of times when you feel like I can't really fight because my opponent's units are just too good at countering certain things, and the windows to fight or the risk reward is not there. That doesn't necessarily mean the matchup's imbalanced. It means it's just either not fun to play or watch. Like, personally, I haven't cast too much TVZ lately, because I like casting longer games, but many longer TVZs just kind of end up at target practice for ghosts who don't miss. So, stuff like that is what we're trying to avoid, but not necessarily actually changing the power level, but instead focusing more on redistributing it. So let's start with Protoss. Protoss gets to relearn the game again. Protoss has a big struggle with the power of certain units and how they're combined together, like the death ball power, where a lot of units like the carrier are able to make it very difficult to actually fight against them, which to an extent is good, but also makes it really frustrating, both sometimes to watch and also to play against. So that is one of the main focuses. The general goal is to allow more stability with non-Stargate unit openers and compositions, reducing reliance and incentive to focus on splash and or burst damage, that damage that essentially you look the other way and suddenly you're hit by a disruptor or storm or archons, all that, giving you a little bit more reliable options. So, what does that mean? It's a lot of good words there. Well, I'm glad you asked. In this case, first is the Observer. Can now be built out of a Nexus after you have a Robo. So that means instead of a couple probes, you can choose to build an Observer instead. And that will allow you to free up some time on the Robo for things like Immortals, Warp Prism, what have you. So you can... this makes it a little bit more in line with the Oracle, where the Oracle kind of serves that same purpose of scouting and damage. You can do it all. That's why you open Stargate in so many games, is because the Oracle can scout like an Observer, but also has potential damage and other utility. An Observer is just an Observer, and it takes extra robo time. So with this, you have a little bit more in the way of options off of the robo early on. But in order to kind of balance it out, until you get a robotic spay, you can no longer use surveillance mode. You can't get that extra, very difficult to remove vision until you commit further down the Robotech path. The battery overcharge. Battery overcharge still has the same amount of relative power, but with the duration increased by 50%, but the cooldown also increased by 50%. This means when you're using it, you have a longer period of reliability, where essentially 20 seconds is almost long enough to get another warp in. So you've defended this base, but with a longer cooldown, once it is used, there's a larger window, over a minute, that especially Terrans, but also Zergs, can potentially exploit. So it no longer feels like every time you try to attack, there's a shield battery overcharge, and you're forced to back off. This is to, like, when you really need it, you have it, but reduces the amount of just feeling like you can't attack a Protoss past a certain stage. Now, the Carrier. The Carrier. Oh, Mr. Carrier. Iconic, but also one of the more frustrating things in StarCraft 2. So we're doing a lot, putting a lot of pieces together and taking a lot away. Supply cost increased to 8 from 6. The build time is increased to 86 seconds from 64, which was the original build time in SC2. The cost increased to 400 and 250, but it finishes with 8 interceptors. So what is the net effect? The Carrier is actually cheaper and builds quicker. Let me explain. Because it started with 4 interceptors before, and now it starts with 8, that time and that cost is pushed onto the Stargate. So that means you can't get as many carriers as quickly, but they actually come out and are at full effectiveness for slightly cheaper. And that, I think, makes it a little more, a little easier to find a window when the carrier count is not so overwhelming, without really significantly reducing the strength of each individual carrier. And now the big change, something that hasn't really been done very much at all in StarCraft 2, that was relatively easy to change, is just the threat priority of the interceptor. On top of reducing the build time, the thought process here is you should pretty much all the time have near maximum interceptors. I personally, as a caster and as a player, I hate whenever the strat is to kill all the interceptors. It's hard to tell if it's actually working. It feels incredibly unreliable. Feels like when it works, it's just because the Protoss overextended, not because the player killing the... Because you can't actually target interceptors. You kind of just hold position your units and hope for the best. So, interceptor threat priority reduced. This means if a unit is within range of a carrier or an interceptor, usually they'll attack the closest threat. And for things like corruptors, that means the swarming bees all around, right? But in this case, the priority would be the carrier, or any other air unit over the interceptor. If you hold position out of range of the carrier, or you're not close enough to attack it, it'll still attack interceptors. You still have that option. But this is just to bring it more in line with the fact the carrier can just A-move. In this case, you could right-click a carrier with corruptors, and they'll continue attacking carriers, unless you tell them otherwise. So that brings it more in line there. Stalker. Now this one, I think a lot of people, the initial reaction will be, are you insane? Because obviously stalkers, in fact stalkers are even more popular than they were. But I still think this is a good idea, at least for something to try out. Because right now the issue with Protoss ground armies is they just can't compete. And this means you have to rely on those huge splash damage units in the later game in order to get anything done. The problem is, that splash damage feels very all or nothing, whether it's Disruptors or Storm against Terran, or essentially the same thing against Zerg. You don't really have any medium options. You have either a huge amount of splash damage, bunch of charge lots, or not much. So Polarity Charge, you guys might recognize where that name is inspired from, on the Templar Archives. So not a quick or easy tech option, but a late game one. Increases the range of stalkers by 1.5. Not 2, but 1.5. That means it'll outrange Marines and Marauders. It'll slightly outrange Hydralisks, assuming you're able, like, in just a straight up fight. And it'll be significantly closer to being able to fight, like, Siege Tanks, Liberators, Lurkers. They'll still be outranged by it, but it'll be less punishing to have a composition more focused around stalkers. Because part of it is stalkers are just so thick. They kind of trip over each other. Like, a stalker itself is about 1 range. So you can only have so many stalkers firing at something before they just start tripping at each other to get into it. And that's part of the reason those gateway-based compositions just don't work as well. Now, the big risk is overbuffing gateway units and making it very difficult to fight in the big game for Terran and especially Zerg with that hero-style composition. But I think with the carrier being less of a just overarching threat and this change coming up, it can balance out a little bit. With the Warp Prism, a buff and a nerf. The Warp Prism back to 150 minerals. Did you know it was originally 200? And then we just kept increasing the cost because its main ability, the Warp Conduit, is so strong. The ability to quickly warp in however many warp gates of charge lots. It no longer has access to Warp Conduit. But it can still warp in. I kind of went back and forth. Actually, a few pro players talking about it as well. It's very important for Protoss to have the ability to reinforce with Warp Gate units. Their units just, by and large, walking across the map, It's just not. It makes ground compositions way too difficult to use. So you can still slowly warp in while the warp prism is phased in and vulnerable. And you can get that warp conduit back with the Matrix Reloaded upgrade on the Cyber Core. It requires a robotics bay, but it's on the Cyber Core. Why is it on the Cyber Core? One, the Robo Bay already has like 7 upgrades. Okay, it's not 7, but it's already a bunch of upgrades. So it would overlap. It would kind of suffer from the same issue that the Observer has. It would overlap a lot of Robo Bay time. But in this case, you could see the Cyber Core upgrading past Warp Gate. It's something that's semi-scoutable. Maybe there's an animation on the Prism. I mean, obviously, when you see the units warping in. But in this case, you can use the Warp Prism off that Robo for cheaper as more of a micro option. One of my favorite things is Warp Prism Micro. With like Immortals, just in the early game with units dodging and stuff like that. And there's a real risk that this actually makes Immortal drop a real threat. So, but I'd rather watch, personally, I'd rather watch and play against like Immortal drop and Blink Stalkers than against Carrier Deathball. I think this would make for more interesting, and even if it is annoying to deal with, it's still not nearly on the same level of 12 charge lots warping into your main and just, yeah. I think these changes kind of redistribute a little more power to a ground army for Protoss, take the teeth out of the carrier somewhat, or at least make it a more of a commitment, because it is a little more vulnerable, a little more costly investment, but definitely not useless. And combined with the other things, well, let's go on. In case Protoss players feeling kind of out of luck there, I think the Stalker change is, I feel strongly that it's something worth trying, at the very least. Even though it's a dramatic and like a core unit change, we've already redesigned Protoss like 4 times, so what's a 5th time? Terrans. Yes. Alright, I'm sure Terrans will agree with everything here. The main goals are to reduce reliance on ghosts. Yep. Diversify options by spreading power to less all or nothing units. So essentially the units, let me make it clear. Let me make it explicit. Ghosts, Mines, and Liberators. They should all have their place, and it should not be everywhere. It is my opinion that those 3 units, they all require kind of like a specific and overwhelming counter to deal with them. There's no reason they all need to be such cheap and easily accessible units. I don't think they should be nerfed into the ground, but I don't think they should be main parts of a core army composition. They should be something that is somewhat costly to invest in. Where there are other units, that I think are more core army units that make sense to have more power in. So first off, Mr. Ghost. Supply cost increased to 3 from 2, bringing it more in line with like a siege tank. And a snipe breaks cloak. So you have to spend the energy to recloak if you're interested in sniping again from cloak. Makes it a little easier. Like, they can no longer just keep getting away with it. That's the intent. They can't just keep getting away with it. Well. And then the alternative options, which I'm not having implemented yet, but I think are maybe either in place of this. I'm pretty committed to the supply cost. I think Ghost should be at least 3 supply. It feels a little ridiculous they're the same supply as a Marauder or a Stalker. This has the effect of in a maxed out army, not so much that you can't build as many Ghosts, but you can't have as much support for the Ghosts. So like, say, a normal maxed out TVZ army of 10-15 Ghosts. Instead of 20 supply, that's now 30 or 35. 36. And that means 1 or 2 less Thors, 3 or 4 less tanks. It doesn't directly reduce the power of the Ghosts, but it reduces the power of everything else. And by that, essentially by taking away from the rest of the army, makes the Ghosts more vulnerable. Now, there's a bit of a give and take on this one, but the Raven gains the Autonomous Superficial Energy Ray, or the Laser. The Light Autonomous Superficial Energy Ray. It's a Templar attack. So the risk is the Raven can now clear creep or observers on its own, because it would also be an air attack, so it wouldn't, essentially so it doesn't wander into the fight. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, being like a Wraith damage level of attack. You could always, like, there's no reason it needs to be 4 damage. It could be 1. Like, we could make it 1. So that, or none. I'm sure there's a way to do that. But, I'm kind of interested to see, like, Ravens also, because observers are more accessible here, and creep is already so oppressive, I wouldn't mind the idea of Ravens having a little bit of a more reliable clearing option. At the risk of a Raven, but, like, I think that's something that kind of balances out the ridiculous amount of vision. And this is what kind of forces Terrans to turtle into the death ball, is like the oppressive nature of creep. Like, creep is just everywhere all the time. It's impossible to move out without them seeing you. And observers are difficult to stop from getting into those disgusting locations. So it'll be interesting to see. Now, very basic nerf to the Liberator, supply cost increased to 4. More in line with the Void Ray. Just, you can't have as many in a maxed out army. A little harder to support in the early game. Relative, like, doesn't actually change the effectiveness, just reduces the ability to have as much to support it or as many Liberators. This is in favor of the unit I think should be the late game siege unit. I don't think Liberators and Ghosts should be the late game siege units. I think they should have utility, they should be options, but you know what unit should be the siege unit? The siege tank. I am strongly of this opinion. It might be a bit too much to just be a base thing, so I include an alternative of adding it in with an upgrade, but siege tank build time reduced by 10%. That's it. You can build them faster, you can replace them quicker. Not by a ton, but just across the board. It adds up over time. Widowmine now gets the Hellbat treatment. I wouldn't even mind probably going back to like 4 Hellbats in a medevac, but Widowmine you can only fit 2 in a medevac. They take up 4 transport slots. Units actually have a tag for how many transport slots they take up, so I don't think this would meaningfully affect too much. It would just, I've never ever been a fan of Widowmine drops personally, and these are personal, like, I don't like watching or playing this changes. It just feels too much like, oh, you screwed up your probes for 1/3 of a second. You lose, or you didn't. Oh, like, Cure won a GSL off this, but I am not a fan of Widowmine drops being, like, and they're not the go-to strat anymore, but still, I don't think they need to be that strong. But you know what unit? It might be starting to fill too many hats. But if it was a unit to fill a lot of different roles, it should be the ultimate transformer. The Viking. Already a solid anti-air and a pretty decent anti-ground. This is to fill in some of the role that nerfing Liberators and Ghosts and buffing the Raven to fight alongside them. The Viking now benefits from the other fusion core upgrades. Advanced Ballistics increases anti-air range to equal with a Broodlord's range. Just by 1, but a Broodlord has 10 range for reference. A carrier actually, I believe, launches its interceptors at 9 range, but don't quote me on that. I know the leash range is longer. But this gives it a little bit more anti-air capability. That is also combined with the Liberator Advanced Ballistics. And then the rapid reignition systems for the medevac also give the Vikings a slight speed upgrade as well. Did you know Vikings are slower than Stalkers on the ground? So with those buffed ranged Stalkers, if you get the rapid reignition systems, you get a little bit more of a chance to get away with them. I think Vikings and siege tanks are cool units. They are conventional units, and we should see them more. I think StarCraft suffers from kind of ability creep. Not literally creep, but somewhat literally creep. There are too many units that require very technical, like, siege up here, cast this spell there. And yeah, I know siege tanks and Vikings require some micro, but it's not. It is definitely not the same level of control that Ghosts and Liberators both demand from the attacker and the defender. Ghosts and Liberators are units that slow the game down and stall it out. Siege tanks and Vikings are brawlers. All right, those are units that are trying to fight as much as possible, at least at the higher levels. So I say bring back Siege Tank Viking and get rid of Ghost Liberator. And by get rid of, I mean reduce its strength so that it's no longer the main army composition. That is my thoughts on Terran. All right, and last but not least, and you know, this one was actually really hard, because I think Zerg should have some basic nerfs, but it's very, because Zerg is so reliant on the queen in the early game. But if you nerf the queen, it changes everything. But if you buff other things, it's very hard to pinpoint anything for Zerg. I'm open, like, this is definitely the least committed of... I think there probably is room for another nerf here. But I pretty much went down the line with every single unit and put a lot of thought into it. It's very hard because of how Zerg works. Without, like, anything you nerf for everyone but Cyril is going to be a disaster. So, but this is where I landed. I like this one. The Creep Tumor. It never made sense to me. A Creep Tumor has more vision range than the Creep Spread. And it's not like it's a lot more. It's only one range more. Like, this is, even pro players I see make this mistake. Pro players will sit on, like, right off the edge of the creep, and the Zerg will see them. Like, they'll be intentionally staying slightly off the edge of the creep, but the Zerg sees the first couple units, because the Creep Tumor has more range than the Creep Spread in vision. Why? Let's get rid of that. The creep, when it's done spreading, or you shut it down, you should know where the line of vision is. It's the creep. So that way, literally, it's much more meaningful actually touching the creep. You'll know exactly where you stand. Like against a sensor tower, you know if you're in the sensor tower, right? So, I think this is a small but actually pretty huge change to how hard it is to outmaneuver a Zerg because of creep. And a surprisingly effective nerf in just vision. But in return, the Infestor and Viper get slimy and slimier spores, which are water balloons. They get the water balloons. I don't know why it's just Templar who have the water balloons. But that way your Vipers and Infestors don't just wander into the fight and die. So I'm on board with giving that to all spellcasters. The one I don't think necessarily should have it is the Disruptor. The Disruptor doesn't have an energy bar. I don't think it's in the same category, personally. But I wouldn't necessarily be against the idea, but it just feels like it's in a different category. I kind of like hemmed and hawed on that, but I landed on not for the Disruptor. Microbial Shroud now sticks to units like Revelation, as opposed to being a Storm Me Here area. So much more usable against those late game air units, but no longer affects buildings. So less reliant on Sporus and more on being able to maneuver. Overlord Speed, discounted again. One Baneling off. And Ultralisk Diet Plan, which is it a buff? The model, hitbox, and attack splash are all reduced by 15%. This number is what allows two Ultras to go side by side in a mineral line. Right now, part of the reason Ultras are so insanely difficult to use. Like, for reference, about 1.5 Ultras can fit in a mineral line, though they'll both try. It makes them a lot easier to use multiple of. We tested doing giving the towering attribute, the one that allows Colossi to walk over things. That just created way too many issues with targeting Banelings and stuff underneath the Ultra. I think a good compromise is a reduction both in the size of the Ultra and its splash damage. It still is a huge unit, but it feels a lot... It's streamlined, so... and is much more usable, especially in the face of... Well, this is partly a reaction to the nerf of the Ghost. I'd like to see more Ultras. I like Ultras. Ultras are cool. This makes them less ridiculous in how much damage they do when they do close the distance, but they also fight more. So, across the board, the intent is to make more fighting units and less turtle units. Now, the main risks, just to reiterate, are nerfing Protoss's utility options and leaving them with nothing but a mediocre ground army. They are leaving Terran in the spot they kind of were before Ghosts were figured out, which is trying to avoid the late game at all costs. And honestly, I think the big risk is just not nerfing Zerg enough to keep people, like, to continue the dominance of Zerg in the mid-game whenever the economies are even. These official or fan-made? They're officially fan-made. I made these. These are mine. We have no news. I have no information on a balance patch from the intern. These are posted on the tweeters. If this is a YouTube video, it'll be in the description. You can argue over it there. Download my fancy infographic, which I actually made last month, but I was like, I don't know. At this point, though, honestly, this is partially inspired by the fact I just don't really want to cast ZVT anymore. Like, ZVT is one of my favorite matchups to watch, but at this point, I avoid casting if the game's over 20 minutes, because the games all look the same. It's kind of like PvZ before the mini balance patch that we had earlier this year. Before Hero, essentially. It's like, yeah, 35-minute game, but how long are we sitting there with nothing happening but carriers slowly gliding around the map, right? So, I don't know if this is going to bring balance, but hopefully it brings entertainment. And I think I am in a relatively unique position. All pro players have an incentive, whether they try to be objective or not. All pro players, their livelihood is reliant upon them winning games of StarCraft. So, implicitly or explicitly, they may have a bias towards whatever race they are most likely to win with. My bias is for people to watch StarCraft and watch me cast it. So making the game as entertaining as possible and as interesting as possible is my bias. So hopefully this serves that purpose. And I look forward to doing some show matches. I'm sure I can get Kiwi on and someone to play at the very least. Maybe a tournament in the near future. But since we have no hint of any further balance adjustments, here's my proposal. And actually, the mod is updating. I can do this live right now for the people. If you want to check it out, all you got to do, put together any melee map, any ladder map, whatever. It doesn't even have to be a ladder map as long as you can add. And then, Winter Balance Dreams. Real rhyme. There you go. I give it a 5 out of 5. Well, I haven't played it yet, but you can bookmark that. Boom, there you go. EU or NA, if you're interested. So, thank you, Rhyme, and thank you guys for watching. I hope this gives you something to argue over. Good luck, have fun.